Hey everyone, welcome to this week's episode of Bible Discoveries, the weekend show. So this week we are taking a look at a chunk of scripture that encompasses everything that you were supposed to read from Monday to Sunday this week, because we are reading through the Bible this year, the entire Bible this year. So on this show, we talk about big issues that pop up, and we also focus on your questions as well. We give priority to your questions and your discussion starters. So thank you so much for sending them in and popping them in the comment section and emailing us, all that good stuff. But if this is your first time here, my name's Corie, and I'm here with Matlock, my husband. Hey.
What's going on?
Stuff from Chronicles.
That's right.
Yeah.
So if you've been following along, we're on First Chronicles this week. Again, this nice pattern of one book a week. It's fantastic.
Yeah, it's quite nice.
I know. If only we could maintain this. It just so happens to be the case.
I feel like this week was the toughest one in the series of weeks that we've had so far, because I don't find First Chronicles particularly stimulating, at least at first.
Right.
So you go through all of the genealogies and all. There's wrong with that. It's just it's a lack of historical narrative at first. Not completely, but I mean, when you compare it with First Kings and Second Kings,
right,
anything's going to be a lack of historical narrative, which I love a good historical narrative.
So Corie,
give it to me, you know?
This brings us to our very first question.
Okay.
Perfect. We're just going to jump right in because it pertains to genealogies and all that stuff that you're so fond of. It is a Bible question, and it is: the book of Chronicles contains extensive genealogies tracing the lineage of individuals and sorry, I'm getting
your phone sounds like it sounded like you were under rapid fire. Like someone was attacking your chair. I'm not sure if the mics picked it up, but that's what
I felt like someone was shooting a gun. I was like, what does that sound? I couldn't.
You know what? Why don't you just restart the question? You'll be fine.
That's so funny. Anyways.
Was it the boys' school? Are we good?
No, it's my dad.
Oh, we're fine.
Fantastic.
Then. It's
just my dad. Just my dad.
You call him back. Let's see if you can read.
Let's actually do this for real. All right. Sorry. The first question is: the book of First Chronicles contains extensive genealogies tracing the lineage of Israelite individuals and tribes. What theological significance do these genealogies hold, and how do they contribute to the overall narrative, which you like so much, of God's covenantal promises and the history of his people?
Okay. So, what theological significance do these genealogies hold? Okay. So first, I think when we're looking at First Chronicles, it really helps to take a step back and look at it more as a bird's eye view. So what I mean by that is we've got, First and Second Samuel recording the time period of this transition between the judges and the kings of Israel. So we've got Saul and David talked about in First and Second Samuel. But then in First and Second Kings, we have the rest of the history of not only the kings of Judah and Jerusalem, but of course, the kings of the split kingdom in northern Israel as well. And it's history. It does have some theological points in there, but it has more of a heavy emphasis on what happened in those different kings' reigns. When we get to Chronicles, First and Second Chronicles are really one book. They're one, we've just split them up for ease of use and convenience. And it's the same thing with Ezra and Nehemiah, which is why they're located directly after First and Second Chronicles. In fact, a lot of people believe that Ezra, which still in the Jewish scriptures today, Ezra and Nehemiah are one. They're considered one book. But we've broken them up to Ezra and Nehemiah just really out of convenience. It's like adding in the chapters and verses. But when you look at the end of Second Chronicles and the beginning of Ezra, it's a tagline to show you that though this has to be written in a different book or a different scroll, it's meant to be read together. So what this tells us is what we know from the context of First Chronicles, is that Chronicles was written after the time period of the Babylonian exile had already happened. So all of the history that we read about in First Kings and Second Kings has already happened by the time First Chronicles is being written. So the Neo-Babylonian Empire has come in, it's destroyed Judah, it's destroyed Jerusalem, it's destroyed the Jerusalem temple, and exiles from Judah have been taken and redistributed throughout the Babylonian Empire. Then the Persian Empire comes in and takes over from the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and the Persian king Cyrus the Great allows not just the exiles of Judah and Israel, but the exiles of a bunch of different nations to go back to their homelands and reset up their sanctuaries. But in the Bible, we're focused just on, obviously, the Jerusalem sanctuary, the Jerusalem temple. So That's a long-winded way of saying that 1st and 2nd Chronicles are written in the context of a displaced people coming back and beginning again. And what a daunting task that would be, because we know from Ezra and Nehemiah, the Babylonian Empire didn't just leave a barren land of Judah. Sure, some people got to stay in Judah, but the entire society was basically uprooted, and other people were brought in and settled the land as well. So there's a lot less population. The population isn't as friendly. It's a different landscape that they're coming back into. So what we see these genealogies of 1st Chronicles doing, it doesn't just tie them back with the kings of Israel and their great-great-grandfathers who occupied the land before. It goes all the way back to Adam and reorients the history of Israel based on the history of mankind. So it replugs in the history and the narrative of Israel back into God's whole redemptive plan for humanity. So it goes back and it begins with Adam, letting us know God is continuing that redemptive arc for humanity, and it's going to happen through these returned exiles, just as God promised to Adam and Eve that a Messiah would come. So he has promised to Judah and Jerusalem that the exiles would return, that the temple would be rebuilt, and that the Messiah would come through the Davidic line. So I think that's the theological significance of those first genealogies of Chronicles. Obviously also, knowing their genealogies, we know was very practical, especially when they were trying to set up the temple. So the Levitical priests, who were the Levitical priests? How could you prove that you were a Levitical priest and you hadn't been, your family line was actually Levitical? Because it was really important for them to still be obeying and following the Mosaic law. Well, they would look to their genealogies in order to do that. And we know that if someone couldn't prove their genealogies, a Levite specifically, they were not allowed to serve in the temple, just in case there had been a mistake in their lineage. And they, in case they had been told a lie about their lineage, essentially. So they were still allowed within Israel. They were still allowed within the assembly of God's people, but they weren't allowed to be a priest. So genealogies were practically very important, but also tied into that big scape. What do you think?
No, I think that's spot on, right? So you start with Adam. You think, well, why would you repeat? Because that's what Genesis is for.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, well, you're telling people, like, you just got out of the exile, we're rebuilding the temple.
Yeah.
Right? This is where you come from, right? And this is who you are, basically.
Mm-hmm.
That's what they're saying. This is our identity. And so they're reestablishing everything. So it's more so like significant to the people of the time.
Yes.
Than it's significant, let's say, for us.
Except that we get to see,
yes,
we get to see how they understood their history, and
sure.
we get to see how God continued the plan. I'm agreeing with you
yes,
and adding more
I
to
agree
it,
with
where
you,
it's
totally,
like,
100%.
Because that's the other element of Chronicles, is that yes, it is just a retelling, essentially, of the scripture, even though it skips over. It goes early Genesis, and then it skips over everything until the time period of the Kings. But in that retelling, there's a lot of theology, and what I mean by that, there's an interpretation of the history that you don't get in 1st and 2nd Kings, and it's really specific to what this group of people needed to understand about their history, what they needed to grasp conceptually in order to be successful in the land, which is really, really interesting.
It is interesting.
Yeah. So there's different focuses.
Yeah.
Then Kings is going to focus on one thing and Chronicles is going to focus on the other because of the audience.
Right.
But us as modern people have that benefit of being able to see both. Right.
And what that does speak to you as well, what it speaks to, is that when the authors are writing, they're not writing it to some ambiguous person they don't know about.
Yeah.
They have an audience in mind. Like the fact that Chronicles was written specifically to the people of the second, who are going to rebuild the second temple.
Yep.
Tells you something about what the authors are thinking.
Yeah.
Right. So it tells you something human about them. Right. It's not just like God speaking to anybody who will listen. No, He's speaking to a specific people at a specific time. And sometimes a lot of people today try to make it like, oh no, this text only applies to me right now. They try to decontextualize the text and to take a verse out of its context, say this is a discrete package of truth in and of itself, right? Like one verse. It's like, well, no. Like nothing's done that way.
No.
Like no book is written that way, right? you still have the standards of humanness that you have to go by, but there's also higher standards as well. Anyway, so yeah, I think that's good.
All right, let's move on then.
Sure.
This question is for you from 1 Chronicles 11 and 2 Samuel 23. So 2 Samuel 23 verse 8 says, Josheb-Basshebeth, a Tachamonite, killed 800 enemy soldiers in a single encounter. But 1 Chronicles 11 verse 11 says, Jashabim, a Hakamonite, only killed 300 in a single encounter. Now, scholars believe this to be the same person. Are these the same men? And if so, is this a contradiction?
Right. So I'm going to say yes. I don't see a reason, like I'm not a scholar myself, but I don't see a reason why they would be wrong in this particular case. Sometimes scholars are wrong and you can use your critical thinking to assess the situation. But I don't see their reason for being. They think that Hakamite and a Tachamonite are just like the same word, basically, a different way of saying the same thing. And that his name is just like a short version. Jashabin is a shorter version of the other one. The other one, Corie said.
Josheb-Basshebeth.
That's right. Yeah,
I don't know.
Yeah, I know. I'm already tongue-tied as it is in some days. Anyways, I don't think this is because of the same men. Then the question is, well, it says 300 in this account and 800 in this account. Okay, so I don't think it's a contradiction. I think this is, again, we talked about this before. Numbers can be easily scribal errors can easily happen with numbers.
Definitely.
And this is the most common form of scribal error. So we believe, that the Bible's inerrant. The original autographs, the original text that was written was inerrant. And then as it passes down, certain mistakes creep in. And we can see if those mistakes are in because, you have 1 Chronicles and 1 Kings. And you can assess the details. Oh, okay. Then we assess, well, what makes practical sense here? Because we can look at history, we can look at archaeology and be like, well, how many actual, if it says, Ryan did a segment a little while ago called All the King's Horses, essentially it dealt with the number 4,000 and 40,000, which is right. Well, dealing with the temple itself, the palace itself and what it could actually hold, if I recall correctly, it was 4,000 was the correct number, 40,000 was too high. But it was a simple scribal error where they have a little dot that goes above the aleph or above the actual word itself, the letter itself. And if that dot smudges at all, it gets removed, then that indicates, the number. So the point I'm trying to say is that because we're not dealing with digital world where things are copied and pasted perfectly from one thing to the next, dealing with, text written by ink, passing through time, and then having to go through time again and, pass on other hands, and then being written down, these type of mistakes creep in. But these aren't like theological mistakes. These are just simply like a number is off or is not precise. And that's what I think the account is here, an 8 versus a 3. Now, at the same time, they're technically not wrong. They could just be, in this case specifically, 2 different encounters that people recall. One encounter where he defeated 300 people and another encounter where he defeated 800. There's no reason why those can't be 2 separate accounts.
Yeah, it's possible. I think that's probably the least likely of the options, only because, David's mighty men had like the mighty men, and then they had 3 captains over top of them, and Jashabim is one of the 3. So he's one of the captains. So this is what they're famously known for, and it specifically says with a spear in both accounts.
Yes.
So it does look like
it's the same account.
It looks like it's the same account.
Yeah, and that's what I lean towards.
So were they rendering like their numbers differently because Samuel was written hundreds of years before Chronicles?
Right.
And so is it that, or is it a later scribal slip of the pen?
There's so many explanations for this. I don't know. But what's amazing is the theology itself and the actual words, distinct from numbers. That's all been, if we look at go down to the early manuscripts, you see how they've been copied over time. There's like remarkable synchronicity between them all. It's like the very odd thing where it's like, oh, okay, this word's wrong. But then you use all the other manuscripts to say, okay, well, this is most likely the account. But when you have early on stuff, like with Hebrew, you're going to have less manuscripts to document. Like in Greek, you have a lot of manuscripts, right? And especially like from after the time, Second Temple period and on, after the time of Christ. But early on, before then, like at this time, we don't have the Dead Sea Scrolls. We have far less material in the Masoretic to assess. It's how we figured out actually that the Red Sea might have actually been called the Reed Sea. Stuff like that. So through assessment of transcripts, we kind of go through and be like, oh, actually this might make more sense because this is where they're located, right? This is what they believe. This is how their alphabet works, etc., etc. This is how the technology that they have and what they have available to them. So long story short, I think it's a scribal error. And I don't think it's a big deal. Either way, I lean towards the 800 number. There are other people who have, I think, defeated 300. And I meant it in a single encounter.
Still, that is a lot of people.
No, it's a lot. But
to kill with a spear.
No, it's true. But I think it would be, if there's other soldiers in the Bible that have also killed 300, it might be less noticeable. It might be less memorable, I would say. It's like, oh, everyone kind of does that. Not everyone, but
I don't know. Yeah,
but maybe I'm just saying. So I think it might.
Yeah,
I'm giving you what I think.
These guys don't have to be like the most. I feel like their exploits don't have to be like the best exploits, but everyone would have recognized them as leaders among the 30 based off of their age, based off of their heritage, based off of their actions, and then also based off of their prowess. What I'm getting at is,
I'm also leaning towards it being the 800. Because it includes the 300. So even
I see what you're saying. I see what you're saying.
But I'm just kind of going off that. But it likely could just be a scribal error. Again, we don't have the original Samuel, 2 Samuel. We don't have the original 1 Chronicles. So those
and
weren't right.
I haven't personally dug into this, so I haven't read any of the literature that's out there digging into like the different the different versions. But what we can know, even as novices who aren't super well read in this specific account of Jashabim, we know that he was one of the 30 and that he was famed for killing a lot of people, defeating a lot of people with a spear. The spear was his weapon of choice, apparently.
That's right.
That's what we know for sure.
Yeah. That's right. I'm just giving you what I think.
Yeah. That's fair. That's fair. That's what this is about. I asked. I want to know what you thought. So.
Let's just move on. I think that sums
Let's do it. Okay.
All right. 1 Chronicles 6 and 16. It's a Bible question for you. 1 Chronicles emphasizes the importance of worship and music in the life of Israel, particularly through the organization of the Levitical priesthood and the establishment of the temple worship under David and Solomon. How does the book explore the theology of worship music?
I feel like this question is a little bit beyond me, if I'm being honest, because music is one of those things I haven't really ever... Like, I know people go to Bible college and they just take worship music courses and just take... That was not me. That was not my track. So I haven't really sat with this and really... But here are my preliminary thoughts. Preliminary thoughts on 1 Chronicles and the concept of David and Solomon really putting an emphasis on music surrounding the temple. First off, we know that the temple, God was to be seen as holy and to be seen as the focal point of life in Israel. That was the ideal. That's what they were aiming for. That's why David wanted to build the temple in the first place. Do you remember? He's sitting there in his beautiful palace with the cedars of Lebanon paneling his walls, feeling like a fancy pants, And he feels bad because God is living in a tent. Because in their society, a palace was better than a tent. So he's like, how people are going to look at Jerusalem and they're going to see that I am the king. Mm-hmm. But God is supposed to be the king, and I'm only the king because of God. And you can see David's thought process here. So he wants to build God a temple that is more grand than David's own palace. So it's this idea, the whole idea behind the temple in the first place was elevating God and giving a clear, in the eyes of the people, obviously he can't really elevate God. God just is elevated. But in the eyes of all visitors and all people, they would see that God was the primary king of Jerusalem and thus of Israel. That was the idea behind it, and it's a good idea. And so I really do think that the grandeur related to the temple is all there. And so, the culture of music that David developed and fostered in Israel, again, all surrounding the worship of God, because again, he was trying to get the culture to point back towards God. Now we know that Solomon reversed that pretty immediately after David's death, but we'll get there. We'll get there. But that was the original idea. And so when you tie that in with Chronicles, remembering that Chronicles was written to a generation of people who had to rebuild the temple. They were essentially seeding and rebuilding Israelite society. So it makes sense that they spent a lot of time in Chronicles talking about the temple, talking about temple worship, because they wanted to redo what David had done, but just not screw it up after.
Right.
So that was the idea. Like, let's reorganize our society around God, including the music, and not screw it up.
Right.
And I mean, we see Ezra and Nehemiah dealing with already them beginning to screw it up because they're humans. But luckily, they were just waiting for the Messiah to come so that he could bring restoration and healing and forgiveness. But that would be my thoughts. Just that the importance of worship and music was literally to make the entire culture point towards the majesty of God and the importance of God, and always bring them back around. Because we know personally as human beings that music influences us. It's a reflection of what's important to us, and vice versa. Right?
Yeah.
Because it can shape the culture, but it's also shaped by the culture because we're the ones that are making it. So it is an important cultural element. And I mean, as far back as you go in human history, we find musical instruments. Even, I mean, one of my favorite things to do, there's all sorts of videos on YouTube where you can go back and you can look at historians trying out the so-called rock gongs, where they're just giant rocks, but they've been worn down in spots by people hitting them with rocks. Yes. And they have a tonal quality to them that's very musical, as opposed to like a regular rock that you hit with another rock just gives like a ting sound. Yeah. It's very cool. Like, as far back as we can go in early history.
Even lyres are amazing. The history of lyres.
Yeah, you mean like a harp, not like you're a liar, but like a liar.
Yeah, liar. Yeah. But yeah.
Yes.
No, I agree with you. It's interesting because there's some people who say, oh, there's only certain things that you can use in certain you can't use certain instruments in worship. Right. And then here you have things that are uncommon that we would say today as trumpets and cymbals, right? Mm-hmm. Specifically in 1 Chronicles 16, chapter 16, verse 42. And there's other instruments listed throughout Psalms as well that would be uncharacteristic of modern worship day music, let's say. Mm-hmm. But what's interesting is a lot of people who come against having certain types of instruments might have been opposed to these instruments.
It's possible.
Yeah. If these instruments are introduced, they'll be like, you can't have trumpets in your... Right?
Man, biblical history is so full of really interesting characters too. Like, when you really look at their personalities, can't really look at their personalities, but when you look at the hints of their personalities as recorded in the scripture, it's like, whew, I think you'd be raising some eyebrows, ruffling some feathers. Yeah. It's full of all sorts of interesting figures and things that might rub our cultural sensitivities in the wrong way.
That's right.
Which is good for us.
Yeah.
No, get outside your bubble.
No, I agree. It is good.
But as to music, I'm not going to jump too much onto my pet peeves, but because who am I? Yeah. But as to the theology of music, outside of it creating a culture that points back to God. Also, when you look at the lyrics that are used, some of the lyrics are recorded here in 1 Chronicles and Kings and Samuel, but also when you look at the book of Psalms, there's so much room for the types of worship music that were sung to God, and some of them are laments, and some of them are just really depressing, and some of them are really angry, but what they all do is they point back to what we know about God, and some of them are just straight praising God, and some of them are even prophetic. Right. Looking towards the future of what God's going to do with the Messiah. But they always bring our attention, no matter where we are, whether we're happy, whether we're sad, whether we're depressed, whether we're really going through a hard time, like a loss, whether we're repenting from sin, they always bring us back around to focusing on the attributes of God and praising God because of who he is, reminding ourselves of who he is. And those are the elements that I think still are so important in worship.
No, I agree with you. And I think what's also prioritized is, okay, so you're establishing a new Israelite culture in Jerusalem. So so if we take this in the New Jerusalem concept, so Christianize it a little bit here. Music's inherent to that. Like, you can't not have music. Mm-hmm. So it's like you need the temple, or you need the people of God. You need songs of praise. But here, verse 42 says sacred song. So songs set apart that are dedicated for worshiping Christ, worshiping God. And it's like, that's really important. And I don't think we can have, you can put a like a little, like a capacitor on it. Be like, oh, you can only do this. You can only use these instruments. You can only do these things. Perhaps you can say, okay, this is what works in our culture here for what we're doing, for how we worship. But I don't think that there is any way to restrict certain instruments that like can't work for worshiping God. It's because if your heart is to worship God and you're using it through these means, now you could argue, well, Matlock, you're worshiping God, but is it corporate worship? That's a different story. So you could have individual worship that you could listen to on the radio, all these different things. You have corporate worship, might be a little bit different. But either way, worship music is inherently like the Psalms. It's inherently like you're saying, despite you might be repenting, you might be forgiving someone, you might be receiving forgiveness, you might be running for your life like David, right? You might be on your deathbed.
Angry.
They're all about giving glory to God inherently. So it's like, I don't think you can put a limit to that. You can be like, what's more profitable for corporate versus non? Sure, you can have that discussion. But anyways, that would be my other 2 cents on top of that. But I do think specifically in terms of Chronicles, it highlights the importance of it and the necessity of it. There's something about music that we as people, especially when it's in the genealogies, as we just talked about. It's tied to the creation of Adam and Eve. It's in there. The worship musicians are passing down from one generation to the next, the seed of Adam, essentially. I don't know how to explain that in a different way. The spirit of Christ is being passed down through them, kind of like the seed of Adam. Anyways, it's a different way of looking at it, but the point of all I'm trying to say is that like there's a relationship there in terms of rebuilding Jerusalem, and part of rebuilding is music. You need that, and you need that to foster the passion of the generations. Anyways.
Yeah, because again, it creates that culture. Like humans are going to listen to music, we're going to sing music, we're going to make music. We just are. Look at any society. We make music. We listen to music. So what does it say? What do your lyrics say about your society, by and large? A lot of times it's pretty rough, but we see in First Chronicles, theirs was focused towards God, which is awesome.
Right.
Awesome. Should we move on?
Let's do it.
Okay. Matlock, First Chronicles 16.
Sure.
What does God mean when he says not to touch his anointed ones? Verse 22 says, touch not my anointed ones. Do my prophets no harm.
Right. Okay.
Ew.
So we're here because this is in the middle of a song. And I know we talked about this in the past, that this verse gets abused on a regular basis because people are like, if a pastor is doing something and people are skeptical and they're like, well, you can't criticize the pastor.
Don't touch the Lord's anointed. Yeah, it's like honor culture and stuff. I first ran into this in my early 20s. I went on a trip with some people from a bunch of different denominations, and we were talking about different teachers. And I started like, we were in a private conversation and they were talking to me about a certain really public figure in the Christian world. And I started kind of criticizing some of the theology, not the person in and of themselves, but the theology that they were teaching, and like asking questions and offering pushback. That's the first time, because I don't come from that hyper charismatic culture, the honor culture and things. I don't come from that. That's the first time I really experienced it in real time, where they were like, don't touch the Lord's anointed. What are you doing? You can't do that. And I was like, okay. Because then we segued off onto someone a pastor who had fallen into sin. And I'm like, well, clearly based off of, the requirements for an elder overseer in 1 Timothy, that they're disqualified now. And they're like, don't touch the Lord's anointed. It was very abrasive because it's used as a way to cover over sin that disqualifies in terms of being a leader in the church. Right? This is often used. It feels like to make excuses for bad behavior. Right. As if someone who is involved in egregious cycles of sin, like we should just don't worry about that. Just don't worry about that because Jesus wipes your slate clean and everything's going to be fine. Yes, Jesus forgives and Jesus restores to repentance, but that doesn't mean that you then can just continue in the avenues that got you involved in that sin in the first place.
So let's a parallel. So this clearly is referring to don't kill my my prophets, right? That's what this means. It doesn't mean don't criticize or
Wait,
critique.
what?
That's just what it means. It's just okay. So now that
Wait,
we know that,
Matlock, what?
that's just what that means. It's about kings not killing, the prophets. Anyways,
Justify yourself, sir.
I don't even need. It's just clearly that's what it's about. But so let's talk about this in a modern sense.
Okay.
So let's make that not about killing or not like severely injuring people. I mean harm. Right? People are like, because in the West we're like, oh, there's psychological harm, there's social harm. Right? It's not just physical harm you're dealing with. There's so many other different layers of harm that you can cause. It's verbal harm. Anyways, so you think about that, like, okay, don't touch my anointed. Okay,
if we're not allowed to criticize.
Yeah, exactly. So what did God do to the man of God in, what is it, 1 Kings 17, when the man of God didn't listen and he got eaten by a lion? He goes, right? So,
that's a rough one. You're just going
he's a man
straight
of God.
For the kill right away.
I know. He's a man of God. For the kill. Yeah, and God's like, okay, well, it's talking about don't harm. He's like, okay. So if someone's doing severe sin, if someone's in that lifestyle, or if you're not going to be able to critique somebody, then you just be like, why can't I critique this person? There's something going on there. No one's above, no one's God. No. Who are you to question God? Well, if there's someone who's just studying and teaching the Bible, you're allowed to ask critical questions. And critical questions should never be met with contempt, because all critical questions, if sincere, are designed to understand. That's what questions are for. Mm-hmm. That's why God asked questions, to Adam and Eve in the garden and stuff. It's like it's designed questions are designed for self-realization, so that you can understand and say the answer out loud and stuff. Anyways, so the point is that in this case, it's speaking about kings don't touch my prophets, basically. Mm-hmm. Don't touch them. But that doesn't mean every single person. That doesn't mean God won't. All right, so it's like God,
and it doesn't mean that they weren't allowed to criticize the prophets. Like when you look into the courts of Ahab,
right?
Evil Ahab. He doesn't like. Was it Messiah? Oh my goodness, the prophet Micaiah. Maybe it's Micaiah. I'm going to have to check myself on this when I'm not talking, so I can go through the scripture and look. But there's a prophet of God that Jehoshaphat is like, Ahab, we're going to go to war, but we need to hear another prophet of God. And Ahab's like, ugh, don't call him. He never promises anything good about me, right? And Messiah or Micaiah, something like that, guys. He goes back and forth with Ahab. He does this tongue in cheek, like, oh, do what you want. Obviously, God's got it. Look at all your other prophets. And Ahab's like, just tell me the truth. And so he doesn't. You see this going back and forth with prophets who disagree with you. And so that's to Ahab's credit that he didn't kill that prophet. And we see that with Zedekiah, King Zedekiah and Jeremiah. There's people who want to kill Jeremiah and there's people who don't want to kill Jeremiah. And the people who don't want to kill Jeremiah win over because they're like, look, all the prophets of God prophesied negative things to all the kings of Jerusalem, but they didn't kill them. Only the evil ones did. Right. So that's in 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles that you can look at that. So it's this idea of you're allowed to criticize them. You're allowed not to listen to them, but killing them would be a sin. Right. I mean, not listening to them also ends up being sinful because you're not heeding the correction of God. Right. But killing them.
Yes.
And then in David's context, where this first comes up, like Second Chronicles is this him kind of talking about this similar thing, but it's always David wouldn't kill Saul because he doesn't want to touch the Lord's anointed. David doesn't want to kill Saul and usurp the throne. He's like, God, if you want me, if you really have anointed me, you're going to do what you want with Saul, right. And then it's this idea of don't kill and then usurp.
Right.
Don't kill for power. Don't kill.
But also too, it's in certain cases, it's like if someone's calling that upon themselves, like it's really hyper contextual because you don't want to. You could be critically thinking about what someone's saying and ask them sincere questions, but you don't want to just like flat out like condemn people's reputation when you don't know anything about them. So it's like
if you don't know anything about them,
yeah, of
but
course.
I mean, like think about King David.
But we know everything about Saul. Is what I was trying to get at. We know these things.
Yes.
Right. It's like we know. So in certain cases. If evidence is building up against somebody, right, you're not coming against them by asking them honest questions, trying to get to the root. Everything should be done to benefit the person. And that primarily no matter what, it's always bringing someone to repentance. We're at the mercy of God. So if someone's thinking in terms of mercy, I'm at God's mercy, then this is not an issue. Mm-hmm. If this is a non-issue. It's only an issue if someone's trying to protect their reputation amidst, allegations that are going around, and those allegations could be true, and that person knows that, let's say they are true, but they're just trying to hide it. So the point is that we're not, human beings ought to be above reproach through Christ. But there are certain situations where, human beings fall and they flounder, they make mistakes, like David with Bathsheba. Even David's a prophet. But, he made big mistakes. He couldn't build the temple because of his mistakes.
And also he was called out by Nathan the prophet.
Yeah, there you go.
In 2 Samuel 12.
He caused David verbal harm. You're not supposed to do that, Corie.
Yeah, and
verbal
would have
harm.
exposed the sin.
Yeah. Psychological harm. Oh, yeah. That's the other thing. If you're really worried about psychological harm, social harm, right, all these different things, then you can't expose the sin and you can't lead someone to repentance, which is like what we're all supposed to be doing on a regular basis, like the Our Father on a daily basis, for those who are like sincerely searching for Christ. So, and living in Christ. So my point is that we could beat this with a stick, with an iron rod if we wanted to, but this verse has got nothing to do with that. It's got nothing to do. There's no concept of social harm and reputational harm. This is like, yeah, you can hurt someone's reputation. You can say that, but that's not what this verse is referring to. It's referring to physical harm. It's very clearly referring to that. And I think, yeah. Do you have any other thoughts on this?
It was Micaiah, 1 Kings 22.
Nailed it. Okay, good. Yeah,
this is gonna drive me nuts. That prophet's name was Micaiah.
Yeah. Anyways, but that, it's silly.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's silly.
We should still, there's an element of we need to give proper respect to people who are spending their lives.
Yeah.
Like our pastors.
Yes.
They are spending their lives on behalf of us.
Yeah.
Their congregation. They're concerned about making sure that we're spiritually healthy, or at least they should be.
Right.
And they're spending time in the scriptures to give to us and to help us and things like that. So there's that correct honor and respect that we read about in the New Testament even.
Right.
That really kind of guides us through that and shows us like the proper familial respect that we need to have for them. But respect does not mean no disagreement. Respect does not mean we should allow them to continue to sin.
Yeah, like
if they're caught in sin,
they
need to be helped out of sin.
That's how you create cults. That's how you create a wolf in sheep's clothing who's constantly, like a ravenous wolf.
Yeah.
Like on the pulpit. That's how you create that, because then you can't question him. You can't even talk to him. You're always wrong. He's always right. It's like, that is a mind-boggling way to look at things.
And like there has to be, for me, there is serious concern for people who are in ministry and use their ministry, their position in ministry to get stuck into horrible sin.
Right.
And then this concept of, well, we'll just restore them. We'll just get them into counseling and they can go back. That's like you don't give a recovered alcoholic alcohol again. You don't make them a bartender. That's not what you do, because it's not good for them. It's placing them. So to take someone to all this talk about, well, we'll just quickly, restore, we'll quickly get them off and deal with it and then restore them again. This is a huge problem in the church today, because we're idolizing these people and we're failing to see them as people. They are fallible people. And so if the reason that they fell into sin was because of the position of authority that they were in, how dare we put them back into a position of authority?
Right.
Because the temptation to fall off into the same sin that they had before is still going to be there. So
right.
I have serious problems with using this.
That's also a bigger issue. The issue with that is putting someone in authority because people like that guy. And he gets a lot of followers.
He speaks really well.
Right, exactly. He teaches really well.
He has a gifting from God.
Right.
Sure. But if they've used that as an avenue for sin, for evil, to destroy other people's lives, no, it's done now. Like their option for restoration is restoration in their relationship with God and restoration for their victims and things of that nature.
He's been devoured by the lion. That's the idea, proverbially. Anyways.
Very sad. But yeah, that's my pet peeve on. Not even a pet peeve. That's just a real issue that I have with.
No, it's a real issue. But again, that comes down to if in the church, if we're looking at people and putting the people on pedestals, and that's We're going to church for this person.
Yeah.
I like this guy. This guy, he does a good job. His sermons are great. All this stuff. It's like, that's why we're going to church? Like, you've missed the point of church, pal.
Yeah.
Completely missed the point. And that's what's happening. That's like all these pop star pastors, whatever you want to call them. Like, it's silly.
Very concerning.
It's very concerning because you're going to church for a guy because you like how he talks. He likes how he makes you feel.
And I don't know if you've noticed, but it's been falling. The last couple decades, it's like it's falling, and we're just having to deal with the fallout now.
Yeah.
I think there is going to be a cultural shift within Christianity, within the church.
Yeah.
But we're having to watch the fall of a lot of people.
Yeah.
And I hope it stops. Don't get me wrong. I hope it stops.
Yeah.
But the way that we've idolized and the way that we've just fed this beast.
Yeah.
It's very concerning.
Yeah. And there's different avenues for how that gets fed, but that's for another day.
Yep. Okay, Matlock,
It's the last
question.
question. Let's do it.
1 Chronicles 17 and 22 and 1 Kings 2. Why,
Okay.
Matlock? Why did God say David could not build the temple for shedding too much blood when shedding blood was the first thing Solomon did as king?
Okay.
Fair.
You
Fair
think it's
question.
fair? You think it's a fair question? Let's
I
get to. Oh
mean,
wow! I don't know.
I
why
have
voice so far
thoughts,
back.
but
You want-
I'm asking you. I want your thoughts.
Yeah. So I think the first thing he does. I don't know why it's taking me so long to get here. The first thing that he does is that he's dealing with his brother who's trying to usurp the throne. Right. So it's not quite the same thing as just going out and just like killing people, right? Or Bathsheba and Uriah and just like murdering someone. This guy is like it's a capital offense to try to create a national rebellion.
Yeah.
And which is going to cost more lives in the long run. So the king, he's thinking like just very practically. This guy's trying to take over the throne, and in doing so, he executes him. But he gives him a chance. He doesn't want to at first.
I don't know. I feel like I feel like it's a little bit of a ruse. But I just don't like Solomon. Like my bias is against Solomon because he led the entire nation into idolatry.
Yeah, he did.
So I have a pretty heavy anti-Solomon bias, but that's
Right.
the hindsight is 2020 kind of thing coming in, right? Like at the beginning of Solomon's reign, was he just trying to get rid of anyone who might challenge him for the throne? I mean, an argument can be made that he was just trying to get rid of anyone who might challenge him for the throne on the advice of David. Is this true? Were they actually after his throne? Maybe. Maybe it's fair. Maybe he did the right thing. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But I'm kind of on the fence about it. But
Look, the
anti-Solomon bias right here.
The
Not
issue
gonna
is
hold it back.
you can't look at this on like contemporary terms. Like the king has to deal, a king of a nation has to deal with so much more than what we have to deal with. That it's like it's not fair to put him on like a peasant's term. Like a peasant doesn't have to deal with that situation of if one peasant comes to me and he doesn't like me, he's going to cause a giant rebellion and lead half the nation. It's like no, that's just not the concern at that low level. At a high level, it's like if you do a misjudgment or if you do the wrong thing, this is what, because you have so much authority, you can usurp. You can create just utter pandemonium and chaos, which leads to utter death, which can lead to apostasy, different things.
I mean, David gives him a hit list.
Yeah.
In 1 Kings 2. David's like, I can't kill these people, but you need to deal with this, Solomon.
Yes,
right? Because he's done. So David gives him a hit list.
Yeah, he does. Joab's on the list.
I love Joab. Sorry, Joab, man. That's rough.
Yeah.
He made some mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes. But yeah, David gives him a little bit of a hit list. So he does the hit list, but he goes beyond the hit list with his brother and stuff too. But he does give his brother a chance, like you're saying. He's like, just don't do this and don't do this. And then his brother asks for a royal wife, which could be seen as positioning.
To take over the throne.
And Bathsheba's like, Solomon, that one.
Yeah.
And so Solomon executes him.
Right. So in this case, it's kind of like they're playing a political game.
Yes.
And one guy Adonijah knows it's coming.
He did. I feel
he knows he's not like he's like, oh, what are you going to murder me for? It's like, no, it's not what that is.
He knew the game he was playing. He knew the risk he was taking.
Exactly. So, whereas in the case of Uriah, he was completely innocent. He went in there, had no chance, and then David murdered him.
He was loyal to David.
He was loyal. Yeah, it's completely different. So that's the reason why David shed too much blood. It wasn't because of warfare, but Uriah specifically, in my mind. So I would say it's a little bit different when there's a contractual agreement between two parties of what is actually going on. People like Adonijah knew that he was going to do something. Solomon knew that he was trying to do something. there was an implicit subtextual understanding between the two. He still tried to move forward with it anyways, which could have led to the nation to rebel. And then, obviously there's an irony here because it ultimately happens anyways, where the nation does, underneath Solomon, rebel and split away under his
Solomon
sins.
rebels.
Right.
He's like, here,
right.
worship at this
at the same
fake
time,
altar.
At the same time,
Solomon.
I don't think it's perceptively at first glance.
Yes, at the beginning of his reign.
Yes.
He hasn't committed murder.
Yes.
He has not committed
right.
murder or apostasy at the beginning.
Right. That's right. So that's the reason why he's able to build the temple and all these different things.
Yes.
But then after that, it gets bad.
It gets real bad.
It gets bad.
Real fast.
Right.
Real fast.
Yeah. So anyways, so that's my opinion on this. So I don't think, I think that's the way it is. I don't know. You can.
No, I agree.
Yeah,
I think it's the perception too. Like, right, David was guilty of murder.
Right.
And Solomon wasn't yet.
Yeah.
Yet.
Yes. Yeah.
At the beginning of his reign. Possibly ever. Like, did he ever, we don't know that he actually murdered someone.
No.
Spiritually created apostates?
Look.
Yes.
If you go into a gladiator ring and you're like, okay, if you take a sword with you, you have to fight and you might die and you might kill someone. Mm-hmm. Only if you take a sword. And you still walk in there and you still take a sword, it's kind of your own fault. In other words,
it's a weird analogy.
Okay. Well, I'm saying,
I understand.
Adonijah took the sword. He had he didn't have to. He still did it. It's not murder. In the same, right? It's a capital offense. In this case, they don't have jails. It's not the same world, right? It's not like you could just put him in prison.
You could have done house arrest.
I guess like Jeremiah put him in a hole.
David did house arrest with Absalom for 3 years. He had to stay in his own palace.
Yeah, except if some guy, I just don't think it's that simple because he can still influence others to take over.
No, I know.
Regardless.
It was cleaner for, I will admit, it was cleaner for Solomon to kill them all. I get it. I just don't like Solomon.
Yeah. I don't even,
he did some good things. He did some terrible things.
This is like,
he's not my favorite.
And granted, we're also in a situation where they're family, because these guys are all family.
Yeah.
All right? This is the family's completely fallen apart. So we're not endorsing.
I know. Joab's his cousin.
Yeah. That you could just kill people. I'm not endorsing that. What I'm saying is that.
That's good.
Because it's indicating, just to be clear.
There's a Game of Thrones going on.
There's a Game of Thrones going on. I've never seen that show, and I don't want to. But
no. But the phrase is an actual phrase.
I thought about it, and I was like, I hate that.
I didn't mean the show. I don't watch. No.
Is it
not me?
No, it's not from the show. The show took the phrase. Anyways, or I guess the books took the phrase. It doesn't matter. The point here is that I'm not endorsing, kings to murdering to kill. No, not all these things. Good. It's a different world. Okay.
Okay.
But the Bible is describing these events happening, and the family is already broken apart.
Indeed.
And that's because of David's misuse and failings. And the family is now broken apart. So this text is identifying something.
Yeah, and God even told David after the incident with Uriah, he's like, now the sword's not going to leave your family.
That's right.
And we see that play out.
And that's exactly right.
Sad.
So, either way, I would say Solomon's still relatively innocent when this whole thing happens. But he has kingly duties that were passed down to him from his dad.
Yep.
And he's doing the best he can to manage with them. And we can.
Fair enough.
Yeah, and that's my 2 cents.
Fair enough.
If sense
Matlock.
Still exists,
Fair enough, Solomon.
That's
whatever.
It. Oh, that's it. I'm done.
All right, guys, let me know what you think in the comments down below. If you have any comments or questions, please put them on down there. Matlock and I will respond as soon as we can. We love reading them. So thank you so much for spending some time with us this weekend. And until next weekend, happy reading and studying. Thank you so much for watching. We want to keep producing high-quality biblical content, but we can't do it without your support. If you feel called to support us, please click the link in the description under Donate. Your support really means a lot to us.